Le damos las muy buenas tardes otra vez. Los invitamos a ir tomando asiento.
You are welcomed again. Please, you are invited to take your seats. Exchange and networking is very interesting, but we need to continue because we have no time.
Así que le solicitamos, por favor.
So we request you to please sit down.
¿Bien? Perfecto. Les agradecemos a todos la presencia.
We thank you for being here, and we want to welcome this second session of the Latin America Energy Transition Investment Forum. This is the high-level discussion on innovative instruments for fostering energetic finance in the region. For Uruguay and from the government of Uruguay, it's a great honor to be the co-host of this discussion space. The Latin America Energy Transition Investment Forum is co-organized with IRENA and the government of Uruguay in cooperation with OLADI and the Inter-American Development Bank. The objective of this session is to discuss on the innovative funding strategies to accelerate investments in energy transition, an aspect which is fundamental for sustainable development and the mitigation of climate change. This debate seeks fostering an environment where innovative financial practices may develop, fostering a greener future, a more sustainable future, and more energy safe. So this is the message of the CCA message from Henry Gonzalez. Video, please.
A ver si podemos arreglar el audio.
Let's see if we could fix the audio.
Estas cosas que siempre pasan.
These things happen. It worked when we tested it, but now it doesn't.
Quizás si les parece voy invitando a los panelistas.
Perhaps I'll be inviting the panelists while we fix this technical issue. Oh, distinguished participants. Good afternoon to the distinguished ministers. Distinguished participants from the Latin American Energy Transition Investment Forum. Good afternoon to the distinguished ministers from the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Salvador, and Costa Rica. To our dear colleagues from the IRENA Climate Smart Accelerator, Wind, Eolic, and Lantern, Global Alliance for the People on the Planet, and also for the representatives of different countries, the private sector, and civil society organizations. From South Korea, I greet you on behalf of the Green Climate Fund, GCF. The climate fund, the biggest climate fund at the global level, whose portfolio is for $4,000 million for development for countries in development, including $600 million for Latin American and Caribbean countries. At the global level, governments, industry leaders, researchers, and other actors are joining efforts to accelerate the transition to resilient and low-carbon economies, aligning our economies with the Paris Agreement to avoid global warming by below 2 degrees, require the use of fossil fuels and go to renewable energy. In this context, the new strategic plan from GCF for the following 4 years establishes ambitious objectives to help development countries for their transition for cleaner energies. Despite emissions in the energy sector are in the 4th place in Latin America after the emissions in the agriculture, the change in the land use, silviculture, and transport, this is still significant in volumes and regarding the growth projections to satisfy the future development needs in the area. We know that several countries in Latin America depend on the resources of hydroelectric energy, which are absolutely susceptible to climate change impacts. Therefore, any transformation in the energy sector might contribute to the adaptation efforts and increasing resilience. In order to accelerate this transition, we need to focus in 4 key areas. Number 1, to guarantee the access to energy for the most vulnerable population. To create markets for new technologies of renewable energies. Number 3, to support the countries in achieving the 50% renewable energy for the year 2030, opening a greater emission of 0 net emissions for 2050. And in the 4th place, to focus in those sectors of economies which are difficult to decarbonize, such as chemicals, steel, transport, and aviation sectors. We see it that Latin America is almost the first region in development, under development, to have the universal access to electricity. However, Latin America and the Caribbean faces a big breach between their energy transition and the investment needed to achieve that transition. The Green Climate Fund estimates that Latin America and the Caribbean needs more than $250 million in investment in order to achieve the 0 net emissions. It's key that most fundings for energy transition comes from the private sector. However, the private sector faces different barriers to invest in projects of clean energy, including the high cost of capital, the macroeconomic volatility, changing exchange rate risks, and regulatory and political risks. Therefore, we do believe that it is important that local systems are developed in order to have capital market access. In order to face those challenges, the region countries can consider some options such as the following. They can strengthen the structures of a PPA to attract investment and experience from the private sector, sharing risks and financial returns. They can also foster the national investment through the creation of markets and support of public policies. They can equally implement acquisition practices compatible with the system, such as hybrids of renewable energies, to reduce the costs of integration to the systems. Besides, they can adopt carbon fixed prices or cap trade with incomes that could be reinvested in energy transition projects. Additionally, we should explore some funding innovative mechanisms to accelerate the energy transition, including green bonds, the philanthropic funds for mitigating risks for private investors, peer investment platforms connecting investments, and the establishment of domestic institutions for green loans. Although some countries in Latin America have already adopted some of these strategies and are harvesting the fruits of these investments, the energy transformation is still a challenge due to the specific risks in each country. The Green Climate Fund, in collaboration with several governments and their entities, accredited entities, are leading the change in the use of innovative funding mechanisms. For example, in alliance with the IDB, we have committed to develop and strengthen green bonus schemes for the efficiency energies. Additionally, we are exploring the possibility of geothermal energy investment as a response of the energy needs and to the context of the region. This also includes initiatives to improve resilience in energy systems in view of extreme climate events, besides the creation of hydroelectric electricity in order to increase agricultural production and to offer heating to the most needed communities. We're exploring strategies to allow countries to mitigate exchange rate risks with the provision of local currency loans. We are almost starting our second program cycle in 2024, and GCF is ready to support the countries of the region in activities that can potentially change the energy sector. A concrete case of this support is a project that has been recently approved on renewable energies in Barbados, which integrates photovoltaic, solar, and energy storage and green hydrogen to supply clean energy 24/7 in Barbados. We are very enthusiastic in continuing building on our portfolio and accelerating the energy transition and having more investment opportunities and support the provision of energy in the territories and the more vulnerable populations. I wish you all very fruitful discussions in this forum. Thank you, and I'm at your disposal.
Los participantes del Foro de Inversión en Transición Energética de América Latina. Muy buenas tardes a los distinguidos ministros de la República Dominicana, Cuba, El Salvador y Costa Rica. A nuestros estimados colegas de la Agencia Internacional de Energías Renovables.
Ya nos había convencido, pero por las dudas queríamos ver si había alguna duda entre el público. Le agradecemos obviamente el mensaje al señor Henry González, que es el director adjunto del Fondo Verde para...
It's a true pleasure to welcome now all the speakers. Mr. Vice Minister of the Ministry of Industry, Rafael Orlando Chuiti. From Cuba, the Vice Minister of Energy and Mining, the Vice Minister of Strategic Management from the Ministry of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica, Carlos Rica Perez Mejia. Mrs. Raquel Moses, General Director of Smart Accelerator, Ramon Fiestas, President for the Latin American region for wind farms, and Isabel Beltran, the Latin American and Caribbean Director for Global Energies for People and the Planet. This is a true pleasure to also invite as a moderator for this panel the Chief of the Energy Division from the IDB, Marcelino Mariali.
Quedan entonces muy bien acompañados.
Muchísimas gracias, Fitzgerald. De nuevo.
Thank you so much, Fitzgerald. Again, we would like to thank the OLARE and the IEA for inviting us. It is a true honor for us from IDB to cooperate at this important event. And during what we have heard during today's session, many of the opportunities that we have ahead of us, but also the investment challenge. Many numbers have been mentioned, I won't repeat them. But the reality is that we need to double or triple investments. IRENA estimates that at a global level, we need to go to $240 trillion. And in Latin America, we have to go for 100 or 200 billions per year towards 2030 in order to continue to accelerate this transition for our countries. So the objective of this panel is to discuss about what we're going to do to find resources, to find funding, capital for the development of these projects. Our Green Fund colleagues earlier on introduced very clearly the instruments that we may use in order to attract more capital, soft financing, blended finance. What can we do with them? IRENA, the green bonds, or even the prices for carbon, how we can generate with them new income. So having said that, basically I'm going to tell our dear panelists, I will ask them to share with us from their scopes what they're doing to facilitate funding. Obviously, for someone to fund a project, these have to be profitable, and then we need to find the proper financial instruments. So the question is just to open up our discussion in the sense, what are you doing from your ministries, from your portfolios, because we are having now representatives from the public sector to facilitate mechanisms for this energy transition. We would like to start with Antonio Almonte from the Dominican Republic. What are your enabling instruments that the government is introducing from the government for this funding? Antonio, you have the floor. Good afternoon. I am Rafael Gomez. Sorry. My colleague was not able to come due to health issues. I am the Vice Ministry of Energy, Rafael Gomez. Thank you, Mr. Marcelino. Basically, from our ministry, we are fostering renewable projects towards the private sector for private companies to fund this through the private banking. How can we do this? Creating incentives for the private sector to be interested in this project that is going to be carried out. For example, we have the Law 5707 mentioned earlier on this morning to provide incentives for renewables, where the investor has access to certain discounts in the rates of interest, and regardless of the equipment that they buy, they also have access to the bonds that this green investment produced. So on top of that, they are able to improve their margins when they invest in new capabilities. So this is the first thing that is injected back into the grid whenever they invest. And this is the first thing that really turns into something very attractive. Back in 2020, we hired 27 renewable energy projects, and they doubled the capacity for renewable generation, and for next year they will triple it. So the investor must feel comfortable with this kind of businesses or signing agreements with the state setting the price. Therefore, they can also have access to the funding in a multilateral bank. Here, back home, we have two cases: the local bank, or you can have a combination of these two segments, the multilateral and the local bank. That way, you have a full service. So with the as Caribbean countries that we are, these are something that is very important. It reduces the funding costs, which many times there is a difference of 30% compared to other regions. So this is reflected in the price of energy. Thank you so much, Rafael. And I think that Rafael mentioned something that is very important and very distinctive of our regions, the additional cost of new infrastructure in areas which receive impacts due to climate change. Insurance companies need to pay premium to protect this infrastructure. We have seen very interesting instruments that are shown to banks which have a design that is more capable of enduring certain wind speeds, and when that happens, premium costs go down. But to do this, you need to take this into consideration right from the beginning when you do your calculations, because these countries are faced with additional challenges. And this leads us to Tatiana, Vice Ministry of Energy in Cuba, for her to please tell us what you're doing, how you're creating this environment to foster the proper funding mechanisms. Thank you for coming. In Cuba, since 2014, there was a public policy being approved for the fostering and development of renewable energies and energy efficiency. Basically, incentives were very similar to the ones that we have in the region. During the 3 or 4 years after renewing the policy, we understood that this was not enough due to the country risk that it implied for Cuba, for private investors and investors coming from abroad. So we have to analyze the application of the UA's blockade against Cuba. It's in the sense that our ministry proposed a different package of incentives, which is still in force, which also gives further details for what we're doing, but basically investing in renewables in Cuba, it is a very profitable business per se. So investments and investors, they don't pay taxes throughout the whole period of investment. They don't pay any tariff for importing the supplies for such investment. The rate of interest for banks are very, very low from national banks. They have warranties. When the total power to be installed goes over a certain amount of megawatts, they can also require an extra warranty from the government. So it varies according to the project size. We study this case by case. And they also have, with the subsidy and the backup of the government, for PPA contracts. The company, the electrical company in Cuba, is a public industry. It has a monopoly, and contracts being closed with investors are take-or-pay contracts. This is the same that happens in the Dominican Republic. These are the first ones to be dispatched. And this is another benefit. And since this is a take-or-pay contract, it is almost mandatory for the operator to put them in front of any other source of generation. These are basically the incentives for renewable energy investments. Additionally, over the last months, in Cuba, we don't have a law. This is a policy that has been passed by the government, but it is not a law. And now we're working with the first draft of energy transition, which should be ready to be presented at the parliament in Cuba next December, with a new package of incentives that will also cover the private sector. In Cuba, up until very recently, the participation of the private sector in the infrastructure, the critical infrastructure of the economy, was almost zero, 96% of companies were state-owned. Now we have a lot of companies that are private working in the energy sector. It is not yet enough. So this is an area where we need to continue studying how to include new operators to come and join the grid, and how to also invite new investors to sign a PPA contract. So this economic openness towards the private sector can imply a strengthening process for the increase of the participation in renewables. The idea is to reach 38% for 2030. So our roadmap is very well defined. I'm not very optimistic in this sense, but given the conditions that were created by the government, according to the versions and the works that we see from our Ministry of Energy and Mining in Cuba, we think that it would be feasible for us to meet this goal. I think that what you're mentioning regarding this is that we would talk about 15–20%, and you would believe that this was something completely out of our reach. But now we see how the region is making progress. So without a shade of a doubt, we think that we can use these PPA instruments to implement this in the whole Latin American region. And this is actually the mechanism which made a difference in the region, to increment solar and wind energies to compensate the drop in hydroelectric production, so we can maintain our markets in this penetration process. Thank you for your intervention. Now, Salvador, of course, is a leading country in geothermal energy. Daniel, what can you tell us about additional efforts from El Salvador to create such environment and mechanisms that will bring the funding of these funds? Sorry, Carlos Isaac from Costa Rica. My notes are wrong. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. I would like to talk about El Salvador. I would love to talk about El Salvador. It's a country that I know very well. I've lived for many years there, and I have true friends, and my wife is from El Salvador. So I would really need to talk very well about El Salvador, right? But let's talk about Costa Rica. First of all, let's put things into perspective. Costa Rica is really interested not only in making progress in energy topics towards a fair transition, but we would also like for all of these things to be related to climate change.
So in that sense, Costa Rica is in its second energy transition. And we are very much interested solving those challenges regarding electromobility, industry electrification, and the management and energy use of herbal and agro-industrial residues. So in order to know which will be the useful financial mechanisms, we have to go to the public policy. So which are the conditions we should create from the institutional point of view to attract or facilitate investment? So in that sense, we have a decarbonization plan which goes from 2018 to 2050 that had some problems for its implementation due to the pandemics, but now it's on its way. So in that sense, the decarbonization plan for Costa Rica takes into consideration precisely the participation of private investment. In fact, it is designed in a way that the private investment is 75% of what has to be done in the following decades. And obviously, each government every 4 years has to show progress, significant progress. With respect to the current government regarding public policy to facilitate those investments, has defined a first aspect, which is what can we do from the point of view of the executive power and what can we do from the legislative assembly point of view. From the executive power, we have been eliminating procedures or restrictions or which made it difficult for the private sector to invest. One, for example, is that certain energy investments are limited due to environmental issues. As Costa Rica has this environmental tradition, then it's quite difficult to reduce them or eliminate those environmental policies, because in fact what carried the success with a certain sustainability system as in Iceland internationally. So we are not eliminating the environmental policies, but we are eliminating those procedures which might create higher transactional costs or that do not facilitate the private investment. So in 2 months we eliminated 1,300 procedures and some in environmental issues for the private sector. Another thing we did was that, well, if Costa Rica wants to have a high private participation in electromobility, we needed to find a way to increase private purchases of electric cars. So we reduced in 70% their taxes so that they are less expensive. It's less expensive to bring those cars to our country, and this allows us to have from every 1 out of 10, and now out of 10 new cars we are going to have 2 electric ones, and we will be increasing that fleet at the private level. But we still need to resolve the public fleet. And there we have been working in alliances with several financial cooperation and technical cooperation institutions, as the GEF and the Green Climate Fund and the IDB and even IRENA and the French Development Agency, among others, to incorporate those elements to allow us to have a certain amount of electric buses and substituting the automotive park using fossil fuels and which have been used for some years already. One of the things you have to observe regarding the decarbonization is that if you are creating a facility is that you have to see that those cars that we are removing they shouldn't be used at a rural area or in another part of the country, because if not, there will not be a real reduction of decarbonizing gases. So we won't be mitigating. So the incentive has to come hand in hand so that the person can acquire this electric car or the company can acquire this electric bus, but we have to find another alternative for these other cars to avoid that they are reused in other parts of the country. Besides, we already have a hydrogen national plan. In the hydrogen national plan, we are doing 2 fundamental things. We are fostering the use of hydrogen for national consumption and driving it to cargo transport. So we opened the space to develop a technological hub, because nothing is final in that area yet. So to see which are the best options to be used at the private level, especially for cargo transport or trains. At the same time, another change we are doing has to do with the electric sector. The economic system we have in Costa Rica is being changed. We are not changing the electric sector, but the economic model with which we have been developing it in order to expand the market, to have a greater private participation. And even the administrators of the sales and purchases of electricity will not be owned by the main producer of energy. It will be independent, and this will create more transparency. So we'll have other actors interested in investing and participating in the energy offer.
En ese caso, ¿verdad? Lo que andamos.
So what we are seeing mainly is that we need to create the following. PPA. Given the restriction the state has to have public investments due to the tax crisis that the country suffered for some years, we have some fiscal policies that limits the investments. So, through the PPAs, the private sector can grow and participate in a stronger way. So then, applying the concept of the carrot behind, we have defined what the shadow price of carbon in Costa Rica is. It's $40 a ton. Perhaps it's cheap if we compare it to Norway, where the price is $400 a ton. But we've seen that, for example, if companies avoid the boilers, they don't have to pay the tax for the carbon. So, okay, and carbon titles. Well, we have used them especially to cover the country of forests. So we had 27% forests, and now we have 60% of forested areas. And now we have the opportunity of using carbon titles precisely for the energy. And these are much better rated, especially at the European market. And now we are opening the space for the green bonds. Green bonds will allow us, through the Ministry of Cattle Grazing, to have resources that we can invest in the energy transition, the second generation energy transition. And we have an experience of exchange of external debt. And these exchanges of external debt have always been used for the nature, so for conservation of natural resources or for forestry investment. We have not used them in the energy sector, but the space is open. So this is my reply for the time being, in case you want to know more about Costa Rica. Carlos, thank you very much. When one hears Costa Rica, one thinks as with Uruguay. So we don't need to 3 times to the industry sector, but you have to decarbonize new borders where you need absolutely new tools. How do I decarbonize transport? And that is the border that is being explored in Latin America and many countries. And for us, it has been a pleasure to go hand in hand with you with these green bonds. I would like to comment also that a country such as Costa Rica and Uruguay, in the crisis of fuels in the world in 2021, in the pandemics, they exported energy, and it was not that they didn't need to control their prices, but they also received incentives to lower them. So how is it that countries that some years ago used fossil fuels and now they export renewable energy, create income, and use less prices, have lower prices. So this gives us the perspective of the different speeds of transitions in the region. So,
from the Caribbean region as a whole, with Rachel Moses, she is the CEO of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. Rachel, what is your view, Rachel, from the Caribbean? What is happening in terms of, financing new instruments, and what is the ecosystem that you see in the Caribbean evolving?
Sure, thank you so much, and thank you to Olade for having me here. So primarily, there are three things that we are doing as the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. There are, all right, I'll start over. All right, I wanted to say thank you first to Olade for having me here and all of the partners. So from the Caribbean perspective, there are three things that we're doing at the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator to address the market challenges that we face, but also to address the opportunity. On the last panel, they talked about the door to hell being opened. We actually think there's a door to heaven, that this new economy is an opportunity for us to transition not just away from fossil fuels, but to be a part of and to be a leading part of the new economy. And that isn't an opportunity that's presented to small island states very often. So there are three things that we're doing. The first thing is a climate smart map, and that is mapping out all of the funds and the opportunities that exist so that we have the chance to amass all of the funds that are available for the projects that are going forward in the region. I could easily identify $1 billion worth of funding available, different kinds of funding for projects, for energy projects in the region. So then if that is the case, what is the challenge, right? We have 29 gigawatts of geothermal potential in our region. And we see that as a key opportunity, not for our internal demand, because our internal demand is a mere fraction of that, but to create, like Chile, like some Mexico, to create an export market for green hydrogen. What is our major contributor to GDP in the Caribbean? Any guesses? Tourism, yes. And so if tourism is our main form of contribution to our GDP, we have ships that are coming, we have planes that are coming, and we need to be a part of the new economy and be an energy provider for that new economy. So that is an area where we're deeply, deeply focused. But in order to do that, because we are small, we need to be connected to each other. And that's a huge investment proposition, and it's scary, quite frankly, because it involves a fair amount of risk. We're working very, very closely with the IDB, who have provided enormous support in helping us to map out not just the things that need to happen, but also what are the funding flows that need to be a part of this transition to get us ready. The second thing that we're doing is we have a financial advisory committee. It's made up of 11 CEOs of regional financial institutions who are all ready to invest in projects, but the projects aren't ready. And that is the challenge that we're facing. So we have a third initiative that we're doing, which is the Caribbean Blended Finance for Resilience. It's a blended financial facility to the tune of about $218 million. We're working with the Caribbean Development Bank, the Government of Canada, and some other collaborating partners. IDB is also a collaborator on that project. And that is to design an instrument apps where
Así que la idea es que diseñemos algo para cerrar la brecha.
So we have an overall position on what are all of the funds that are available, and we help to match make those with the projects. Then we have the 11 CEOs of the regional financial institutions that are also helping us to close the gap and are interested in projects. We're also working with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, because we think that that is also another opportunity to help close the gap. And then we have this blended finance that we're looking for our anchor investor, but we're working very closely with a number of partners. And then what we're seeing is that the readiness and the preparation of those projects is the key piece. So if I were to say one more thing that we are doing, that we have to do, that we realize is sort of the secret sauce that will close the gap, is an innovation fund. And that fund is primarily funded by philanthropy to help to prepare projects so that we can unlock all of the funding that's available, and that can help the projects to access them. You know, on the earlier panel as well, they talked about you can't compare Paraguay to Uruguay, and think of, you can't compare Paraguay, Uruguay, Mexico to St. Lucia, to Grenada, to Trinidad and Tobago, where I'm from, because we are so much smaller. And so when projects have dedicated resources that are able to access funding from GCF that's doing amazing work, we don't have the same level of capacity to do that. So we have to get innovative by finding ways to help philanthropy to close the gap. The biggest issue we see is that we're talking about different types of financing needs. And so we talk a lot about accessing debt. And debt is great and very, very useful in the energy transition. But if you're not yet at the place to be able to access debt, then you have to use philanthropy to close that gap till you can get to the point of being able to access equity or debt, or you can prepare the project to access any kind of innovative financial instrument that may be available. So those are the things that we're doing in order to just close the gap for the Caribbean region.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and I think that gives us another perspective of what are.
Muchas gracias. Creo que eso nos da una buena perspectiva de lo que está sucediendo en el mercado. Y necesitamos proyectos.
Resources to prepare those projects and making the scale in aggregate in all the Caribbean to make a better preposition. And you mentioned something that is definitely an important opportunity for the Caribbean that no others have, which is engaging the Caribbean in the fuels of the future for the shipping industry, because you are definitely the hub in the region where all the major ships for tourism arrive. So I think that's a very important message from the Caribbean. We sort of heard, Ramón, ya más o menos aquí escuchamos.
We already heard Ramon saying, sometimes what we really need is to have more projects. Since you work in Global Wind Energy Council, in this association, which is the most important one for generation of wind power in the world, there is a funding challenge, there is a project challenge. What can you share with us from the private sector for wind industry? How much do you think you need to work in order to overcome these funding obstacles? What would you say that you need to do? This is a great question, Marcelino. Thank you very much, Oladi, for this invitation and for considering me to be part of this top-level panel and to share our reflections and to learn from the lessons learned of other countries. We were able to identify completely different realities according to the markets where we are in the region. So we cannot say that there is a transversal problem affecting all countries in the same way, at least, because that wouldn't be fair. That's not the case. From the development of new technology perspective in Latin America, there is a country that can be better in terms of the level of investment that they are able to receive, and that is Brazil. Brazil, from the wind perspective, is 50% of wind generation for the region. It has been like this for over 10 years, and they accumulate about 60% in terms of the accumulative wind power for the region. As a result, they are completely separate case, and in that sense, this is the country receiving the most investment and funding, and it makes sense. So over the last years, we're talking about investments of around $7,000 or $8,000 million. Most of this goes directly to Brazil, and it is distributed in other markets like Mexico, which is the second market. And according to their policy decisions, they were able to be ranked in the second position. And this connects with my second thought. There is not a lack of projects. I don't think that's the case. In Latin America, we have many projects for renewable energies to reach the goals towards 2030 and 2050. There are several projects, many projects, for both wind and photovoltaic energy, which are very good indeed when we take into account their efficiency. At the level of the deliverables for the energy production for our end consumers, we're talking about very competitive technologies in most of these markets, if not the most competitive, to be honest. So what I'm saying is that we are identifying in some of the markets these obstacles that are huge against the investment for projects that are not finding the agility to make progress. And I'm talking about procedure, processes, maybe not finding the right permits or the right authorizations to be installed, to be kicked off. And this is sometimes due to lack of proper infrastructure in the electrical industry to make these connections happen. Sometimes it is a true hell for promoters because the funding processes for environmental topics are very complicated and intertwined roads that we really need to try to solve. And this, at the end of the day, makes the terms to be endless. The other thing that I see as an obstacle that is a bit more difficult to overcome has to do with those countries that, even though they have applied favorable policies towards private investment, they have closed their doors and they have impeded for this private investment to carry on their work, and this resulted in the frustration of huge expectations for existing projects in these markets. Markets which that really were hoping for maybe a later momentum to maybe recover this dynamic of private investment for the renewable energy sector. So we don't identify a lack of funding, not at all. There is enough funding for projects, and there is an interest from the investor standpoint to do this, to make this happen. The problem is the process. So as you know, the energy projects mainly from a contract for supply in the long term, the investment will be able to get close to the funding party and then propose a solution through our loans or through our funding of a project to make this happen. So we could talk about innovative mechanisms in this sense, because we think that many times this formula, the way that the funding is proposed, is really, how can I say, like old-fashioned from an ideology standpoint. It has not been renewed. It is not promoting the funding, because they are trying to eliminate all risks, and in doing so, they are not fostering investors because of due diligence. So we understand that the challenges for the climate energy crisis, that means to triple investment in the region, apart from alleviating these procedures that I was making reference to, of lifting these obstacles to investment, this should be reformulated through mechanisms for funding which had into account or were more flexible for these investments. What I mean is to be able to fund in a more agile way these new or emergent projects. So for the signals, when a market is given a signal that they are ready to receive investment, it is because there is an already solid structure, because they were able to recover from other loans, so they are ready. So we don't need to continue to establish mitigation risk formula that delays everything. And this is where the public administration could use this mixed finance or this blended finance to reduce this risk. And this would be innovative. So we don't have to be waiting for contracts that are for long term, 50, 20 years, because that would result in something that is extremely complex or even not convenient for our electrical systems. So why not funding at a shorter term with mechanisms that would be capable of covering those short-term risks? And that would be all. Ramon, I think that your perspective is very interesting in the sense that we do have investors, we do have funding, or how the situation is very different in the region, but the fact that we can make a forecast for the region and bring the individual efforts, we are competing with the rest of the world to receive this funding. And when we talk about permits, all the paperwork, all the bureaucracy, this is like a red tape for us, and this increases the cost of funding at the end of the day. So this is something that we need to apply also when we change our mindset, thinking about future strategies and how to fund projects that didn't include long-term contracts. What are the funding mechanisms to protect these merchant trade? What do you think you could suggest? This is a very important segment that is moving forward in the region, and we really need to continue working in this sense, because tomorrow we're going to be talking about the way in which our markets operate. Our markets need to change the way they operate, because that will be a catalyzer for many investment in the region. And these visions of maybe having to continue to move forward towards being more flexible so we can continue to be attractive. That way we would be able to bring more investors who would be able to run into different kinds of risks. So that is what we want. We want to analyze different risk profiles to bring different investors. Can I clarify something?
¿Cómo le dice esto? En mi país, en República Dominicana, hay 3 generadoras que no pidieron PPA, sino que firmaron un contrato con un usuario no regular, con una empresa cervecera, con una empresa fábrica de aceite, y ellos.
And that's one way they say, in my country we have an example for what you're saying. We have to be more flexible. And when a company changed this term, they say, okay, if this project is not moving forward with the public bank, maybe I can go and knock at the private bank. Let's see what happens there. So this is another change that we can introduce. Normally they pay a fee, and they're operating and selling in the market because they only tried with one bank. Yes, that is true. Sometimes you have a limited capacity of payment, and that is not enough for you to get exposure to other investments. So this is another key area. How do you expose your country to other investment? We were mentioning about philanthropy before, and this is something that I would like to join and relate or link to the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, Isabel Beltram. She's the subdirector for Latin America. These new kind of stakeholders, that is very important, they are coming into play for these investments. Isabel, I am sorry if I am not right. I made a lot of mistakes with the name. This has been a very fruitful meeting. I'm sorry I didn't have the right names in my agenda. But the risk is, this is a philanthropy in itself, right?
So we're speaking about actors that are making a real difference. And I want to thank you for the just transition we are doing in the region. So what are the tools that you are being fostering, Isabel? Thank you very much, Marcelina. Marcelino, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to participate and tell you what we are doing from HEAP. HEAP is working with philanthropic capital, and it's new in Latin America, in the region, and in the sector. Our philanthropic capital provides us the flexibility of funding and supporting countries in energy transition and access and universal access in different ways. We try to support the countries to have this transition with technical assistance, training regarding regulatory environments, permits. It also allows us to work as a capital provision for testing innovative technologies and different renewable systems. It also allows us to provide equity capital for the debt, and also for Latin America it allows us to test these financial tools, so we can have guarantee issues, and this will allow the countries to define which are the innovative financial tools that might work in the different realities regarding the structures of sustainable bonds, how to structure PPAs or that are successful. So in our recently approved strategy for Latin America, we made it clear that we want to offer universal access, focusing on the justice of energy transition and not leaving anyone behind. So we will need to focus on universal access. And regarding energy transition, to support the habilitating environment from private investments. Part of the philanthropy in which the philanthropy can have a biggest impact is to use these philanthropic capitals is to leverage investments from the private sector. So we try to fill those gaps which might be where the financial international banks cannot support, and the countries do need it, and the private sector do needs us. So that's the main value of HEAP and philanthropy in general. So we focus on energy, Caribbean, especially in the Caribbean, for energy resilience based on the impact of climate change in the Isles and the need to support this energy transition with a justice approach. So this is what we've been doing in our strategy. We work very jointly with the IDB, who allowed us to work, and we want to expand our task in Latin America and to bring from Latin America to the rest of the regions. We also operate in Asia and Africa, so we want to apply the lessons learned, applying these innovative instruments for the last mile.
Muchísimas gracias, Isabel. Pusiste ejemplo.
Thank you very much. Your examples were very clear. So we are working with blended finance, with GAP, with funds from South Korea to make these small projects viable for the access where philanthropy makes a very big difference. If you allow me, because I think we are about to finish, so there's some time for some questions from the audience. We have magnificent panelists, so I open this in case there are questions from the public. We saw very different perspectives from Central America, from the Caribbean, from philanthropy, from the big associations of renewable energy companies, so please.
Gracias. Me llamó bastante.
Thank you. It called my attention, the last intervention, because as I said before, I represent two associations, community-based associations in Nicaragua with projects in operation, with two distribution and trade. So we have our own customers. We have paid a loan that the World Bank gave us, which came together with a subsidy for electrification. The situation in Nicaragua changed a lot, but we as operators have a need to expand our generation, and we have a project that this is why Irina has helped us be here today. So our question is, we have contacted our foundations, our philanthropy organizations, and usually they speak about collaboration as a way of subordinated debt. At least in the training we had with Irina, they mentioned this capacity of measuring this subordinated, which is not from the investment. So we are like the investors, but we don't have profits. We are a non-profit. So every utility is or benefit is reinvested in the communities and in different projects, social projects. So the question is, how, first, if Nicaragua could be eligible due to the sanctions, and especially with the IDB, because apparently IDB is not working in Nicaragua, but how could we materialize that collaboration, thinking, as I was saying from the beginning, that that contribution as a subordinated debt and with the bank, perhaps with the debt coverage ratio, so to have a calmer, so bearing in mind we are apparently from the civil society, and although we submitted a very high level engineering, we are always seen as a more risky organization. Thank you.
Tomamos, si quieren, de una vez la otra pregunta por aquí al frente.
We'll take the next question and then we answer both, okay?
For AMI, an energy research company, I completely agree with what you said about there being projects and good projects in the region, and I think what's missing is affordable financing, right? There's financing, but financing at interest rates that make sense for the investor looking into that development. My question is more on the side of permitting. It takes 10 to 15 years to develop a transmission line in the US and also in several different countries in Latin America. How do you accelerate that permitting process to ensure that projects are profitable from the investor point of view? Thank you.
That's a very good question. Isabel, if you want to take on the first one, and then I'll ask a couple of panelists to react to the second.
Claro, Marcelino.
Our type of capital allows us to make an evaluation of each of the projects and see which the needs are in each of the projects. Sometimes all the subordinate, sometimes it's subsidies, in other cases it's guarantees. So we would need to explore the project in detail and define which are the impacts, the expected impacts, and the leveraging, expected leveraging, and the access, which are the approaches we have. So I would be glad to talk to you after the panel. No, we don't have a prior view or saying yes or not without exploring the project. Thank you very much, Cecilia. And now we are going to answer the second question regarding permitting. And here it would be if Rafael and Carlos tell us the country perspective, if you have had certain certain procedures to accelerate the permits. Because a solar plant, you build it in 8 months, but then the line will take 4 years. So is Dominican doing something? Yes, permits are always a problem. And even when one pushes to make them quicker, well, you learn from difficulties. First, we have the environmental permit. Normally, the investor can only submit it once they have a final definition. But without an environmental permit, the bank will not finance the project. So normally, normally they have to have an okay from the transmission company so that they can connect in this or that side. But sometimes there's no capacity. And sometimes what we do is that the transmission company reaches an agreement so that the investor builds the lacking line, sometimes 3, 4, 5 kilometers to the grid, and then they have a repayment mechanism between the connection and the investment. The permits for us, some of the issues that we follow, we give close attention. Because sometimes the investor can be in default because they don't have the permit. So normally, if the permit is not there, they won't have the funds. So all the procedures they do is what they do, but we're working on that. We have created a single window where all the permits enter and you see them online and you see how they are being executed. We still have room for improvement, but we're working on this single window. And taking this about the permits, we're going to answer. So in the case of Cuba, we also have a single window for the investments, and regarding the interconnection with the grid, from the PPA, we guarantee that the electric company will be in charge of all the interconnection process. In case there was a need to make an investment induced from the process due to being very far away from the existing grid, the new investment, then the investor will provide it by the electric company is the one who builds the line and executes the works, and it's always reflected, or almost always reflected in the PPA. So for the investor, there's no problem because the counterpart in the PPA takes this cost. Thank you very much, Tatiana. So you see how risk distribution is so important. Carlos, do you want to add something? Well, thank you for your question. It's great. I see this like this. It's important to find the mechanisms to accelerate projects. It's important to see which are the bottlenecks which don't allow the project to make progress. But we also have to see, especially in Costa Rica and everywhere, which were the elements that delayed investments in the energy sector. There were two which had a great impact. Number two, from previous governments, we inherited an 8-year no culture. So no, it can't be done. No, look for something else. No, this can't be done here. And the other thing is that companies that had already invested to produce with renewable energy were removed from the market. So we found companies that were surviving with bitcoins when they were precisely made to contribute in the production of renewable energy and incorporate it in the interconnected system. So we had to rescue those companies and again renew their contracts, define a satisfactory price for them to continue producing, and removing them from Bitcoin mining so that this energy was available for the national consumption. The other thing we did was to eliminate a series of unnecessary steps to approve permits, or certain permits, so that projects were feasible. And we are periodically reviewing that. In fact, there's a national committee that periodically, regularly reviews where the bottlenecks are, which are against the private investment, so that in this issue of energy we can make progress. Regarding environmental economy and in energy as well, well, you can have a big broadband, so you can have a set of restrictions or you can have a set of incentives. One decides which the best path for the country is. But if we want to comply with a decarbonizing goal, we want to comply with an energy transition, we have to break those paradigms and devote time to the solution of problems. It's a public responsibility we currently have. If I were in the private sector, well, I come from the private sector, I would be asking this, and I would be looking for the ways for the public sector to solve these restrictions in order to grow. The energy transition is not easy, not only due to the fact of the changes of paradigms which have to be modified, but also because there are no financial resources to contribute to those changes to take part in a quick way. So we need to strongly work on that. For example, I have the talent, together with other people in the ministry, to have the decarbonization bond, because it would be a much important contribution for private investors, and to move the arrow and to mitigate greenhouse gas effects. But we are not limited to look for other initiatives, so that precisely we can work. In summary, we need to invest a lot of time to break those bottlenecks, to change the no culture, and to look for the greater private participation, because investments in decarbonization of economies are very high, and the public sector cannot overcome them on their own. Thank you. Thank you very much, Carlos, and great observation. So instead of being a big regulator, you have to be a big facilitator. So being the regulator of regulators, I remember he set a rule which was very interesting. For each additional regulation, you have to remove 2. That was a law, a regulation that was in Mexico like 4 years ago. So we had to issue a regulation for the electric sector, and what you were mentioning, we continuously look for, if you continuously look for how to solve and simplify, you see. So how, and it's very interesting, with single windows we can simplify. And I don't know if, I think there are some other questions, but Ramon, do you want to complement this very quickly? Okay, only 2 ideas. Freedom of investment for the grids, for the energy grids. So the generator has to be able to develop, and there has to be a regulation for the retribution of those investments. And 2, simplifying administrative procedures, and this implies an update of the right of legal right, administrative right in each of the countries with the climate goals, and this is fundamental.
Regarding the legislation and getting the authorization to simplify paperwork, we need to shorten terms, and we need to introduce something that is very important. The administrative silence must be positive. This is a judicial figure that enables us to get your permits if they are not answering after a certain period of time. So due to the lack of response, you can say that it was approved. We should use that. Yes, I come from West Company, Chile, a consulting firm. I think that is fascinating. The fact that you are developing strategies for the energy plants and the decontamination of the planet. But what happens in Latin America? I think that this is over the worldwide standard in terms of the use and the reduction of emissions for greenhouse gases. So my doubt is, why are they asking Latin America to triple their production if this is something that the whole world should do? I think that we're like paying a price. Of course, we all must improve our emissions and reduce them and stop contaminating. But I think that to oblige or to promote the use of new projects from the public standpoint goes against the growth of Latin America, because Latin America, what are we giving to the world? We are already given renewable energy. What do we have in return? We have the technology of using renewable energy. So we buy technology coming from the northern hemisphere. So we are not competitive compared to Asia or China because they continue to carbonize their industries. So in the end, the only thing that this is doing is punishing us, because in the end we are not competitive. Nowadays we should be focusing on exporting, and what we're doing is taking renewable resources and bringing them and putting them to the service of other companies. So Latin America has a huge need from the standpoint of electrification, areas where we don't have access to energy and we don't have funding for that. Why don't we work on that first? Because we are a reference, worldwide reference as an environmental green region. Our greenhouses are marginal compared to the rest of the countries in the world. However, they are imposing a model that they want to replicate with us, and they are the one contaminating, so I don't understand. This is a very good observation.
Reaccionamos un poquito.
Sí, abundando, solo comentar el aspecto de la desigualdad.
Yes. Due to the lack of equality that the region undergoes, these mechanisms, and I say this very dearly because the arena is the one who invited us, but this is not taking into account the participation of people and how the renewable energy can serve as an element to develop those populations that are impoverished. In the case of Chile, this is something that we can say they were displaced to other zones where there is a lot of wind. And now what? Are we going to ask these communities to go elsewhere because we want to make the most of the wind? They were already displaced because of other interests that we have. Yes, it is true what you say, but since Latin America is the leader for energy transition, this is also the region in the world which is developing that is closer to achieving this universal access, 97%. There's no other place in the world reaching 100%. I mean, developing countries. So technologies as solar enable us now to be able to electrify communities that we would never think of in the past. From the bank, we have connected 2 million users over the last 5 years, and many of them thanks to the reduction of the cost that the solar energy means. Because if you want to extend this to the highlands in Bolivia, it's impossible to do this with wire transmission. So it is true that we need to reduce this lack of equality gap. It is true what you say. But I think that, I don't know if my colleagues want to react. This won't be fair for us. We need to do the transition in our own terms. I agree. This shouldn't be imposed to us. I agree with what you say, but each country have their own transition, and they define how they would follow. I speak on behalf of the Dominican Republic. We don't have oil, we don't have carbon, we don't have natural gas, and the water that we have is not enough for us to drink it. So there is no other way. We need to develop renewable energies to lower our dependency on fossil fuels. This will create, which creates a very expensive utility bill. So we really need to, regardless of the political fluctuation, we really need to develop this. It is going to be fruitful for us. So every time the price of the fuel goes up, the price of energy goes up. So imagine how people can cope with this. Each community should have a plan. We at the Dominican Republic, we have a rural electrification unit where we bring this energy to those communities that are the furthest away from the metropolitan areas. So as my IDB colleague said, these small central solar plants that can feed household, this is a benefit because we are able to reach those communities that are very far away. So we need to push this further. This is where we need to go because the social aspect is huge, the impact that it will have. So every time we talk about a small solar electrification projects in the faces of those children and the elderly, because their perspective in life will change completely because now they have electricity. This is huge. They can watch TV, they can study remotely, they can connect a laptop. This changes people's life. And this is why we should continue working towards these ends. So we not only have to see the transition aspect to reduce emissions, that is true, but bring electricity to those who need it the most. This is super important. So this is the direction we need to head. Someone is telling me that we have already run out of time. Just one more minute, Marcelino. I think that it's also important to take a look at this. This is not an imposition, Ricardo Corini said from Marina. We are advancing all together. If we don't, we will suffer the consequences, all of us in the planet. So this is not an imposition. Of course, we cannot deny that the global trend is towards decarbonization, but Latin America is now presenting a comparative advantage because of our energy mix. But this is not meaning that this advantage is going to be kept in the future if we don't do anything. So this gives us an opportunity to rethink our economies and see how we can reposition ourselves so we can continue to lead this transition in the region. Let's make of this an advantage for us. This is not an imposition, though I understand your point, but this is an opportunity for having the vision to capitalize the trend and our comparative advantage.
Only to agree.
And we'll close.
Only to agree that this is an opportunity. In the Caribbean, our emissions will not make a difference. If we don't decarbonize, no one will care. It is for us a competitive advantage to get ahead so that we are the ones leading the economies of the future.
Muchísimas gracias. Con eso yo creo que cerramos un panel que fue magnífico.
Thank you so much. I think that this was a very fruitful panel. Isabel, Rachel, Ramon, Carlos, Tatiana, and Orlando, thank you so much for your participation, and Fitzgerald for being our moderator. Thank you. This has been excellent. We will not ask for any further conclusions. Thank you, everyone. We will now close for today's session, and we would like to invite you to join us tomorrow at 9 from Picasso Room in this floor, where we will have the deep live session for the implementation of transition projects for energy transition. Thank you so much.